I never thought I would be standing in my own son's living room, listening to him tell his friends that I was a nobody, that I had never accomplished anything in my life, that he was embarrassed to have me as his mother. But there I was, 62 years old, holding a casserole dish I had spent 3 hours preparing, frozen in the hallway while my son Marcus laughed with his colleagues from the real estate firm. My feet wouldn't move. My hands gripped the ceramic dish so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could smell the chicken and rice, the special seasoning I had used since Marcus was just a little boy with scraped knees and a gap-toothed smile. I had woken up early that morning to prepare his favorite meal, just as I had done hundreds of times throughout his childhood. The hallway was dark, lit only by the soft glow from the living room where Marcus entertained his guests. I could see his silhouette through the doorway, the confident way he held himself, the way he commanded the room with his presence. He had inherited that from his father, that ability to make everyone around him feel like they were in the presence of someone important. Marcus said, "Yeah, my mom's here somewhere. She likes to drop by unannounced." You know how it is with older people, they get lonely. One of his friends, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, asked, "What does she do?" Marcus laughed again, and the sound cut through me like a knife being twisted slowly in my chest. I had heard that laugh before, at school plays and birthday parties and graduation ceremonies. But this laugh was different. This laugh was dismissive, cruel. He said, "Do? She doesn't do anything, never has. My dad was the one who worked. She just stayed home, cooked, cleaned. The typical housewife story. No ambition, no drive. I honestly don't know how she fills her days now. She probably watches those daytime talk shows and clips coupons. Maybe she does crossword puzzles. That seems like something she would do." I stood there, my hands trembling around the ceramic dish. The casserole was still warm. I had made his favorite, the recipe I had perfected over 30 years of cooking for my family. I had added extra chicken because I knew Marcus liked it that way, and I had used the imported paprika from the specialty store across town because the regular kind just wasn't the same. Another voice, male this time, deep and condescending, said, "That's rough, man. Must be hard having a parent who never really made something of themselves. My parents were the same way. It's like they never even tried. They were content to just exist, you know? No vision, no ambition." Marcus replied, "It is what it is. I just wish she'd stop showing up here all the time. It's embarrassing, you know? I've built all this myself, from the ground up, and she just exists. She shuffles around in her old clothes, tells the same stories over and over. Half the time I wonder if she's even paying attention to what I've accomplished. I'll tell her about a deal I closed and she'll just smile and nod like she doesn't understand any of it." The blonde woman laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated against my ears. She said, "At least she raised you well enough that you could escape that life." Some people never break free from their parents' mediocrity. Marcus said, "True, I guess I have to give her some credit for that. But honestly, it was more about survival instinct. I saw what they had, what they didn't have, and I knew I wanted more." I wasn't going to end up like them, living in some tiny apartment, counting every penny, never experiencing anything. A third voice chimed in, someone I couldn't see from my position in the hallway. He said, "The self-made man. I respect that, Marcus. Not everyone has the strength to rise above their circumstances." Marcus said, "Thanks, Greg. It wasn't easy. I had to work twice as hard as everyone else because I didn't have connections or family money to fall back on. When I first started in this business, I had nothing. Literally nothing. Just the clothes on my back and a determination to succeed. I wanted to walk in there. I wanted to set the dish down on his expensive marble countertop and tell him exactly who I was. Who I really was. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that everything he thought he knew was wrong. I wanted to tell him about the early mornings and late nights, about the sacrifices his father and I had made, about the dreams we had built together, brick by brick, property by property, over 4 decades of partnership. But I didn't. Instead, I quietly set the casserole on the hallway table, careful not to make a sound. I turned around, my hand trailing along the wall I had chosen the paint color for when Marcus had first moved in. He had asked for my opinion on the shade of white, one of the rare times he had valued my input. I had told him soft ivory would make the space feel warm and inviting. He had rolled his eyes but gone with my suggestion anyway. I walked out the front door, closing it gently behind me. The night air was cold against my face, and I realized there were tears on my cheeks. I hadn't even felt them fall. I drove home in silence, my vision blurred by tears I refused to let fall. The streets were quiet at this hour, the houses dark except for the occasional glow of a television through drawn curtains. I passed the neighborhood where Daniel and I had first lived, a modest collection of small homes and narrow streets that seemed impossibly far from the life Marcus now led. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the one I had chosen to live in after my husband Daniel passed away 4 years ago. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a living room with a view of the park across the street. The furniture was comfortable but simple, nothing that would draw attention or suggest anything about my financial situation. I had painted the walls myself when I moved in, a soft sage green that reminded me of the garden Daniel and I had tended together for so many years. The curtains were handmade, sewn on a machine I had owned since before Marcus was born. The photographs on the walls were of family moments, birthdays and holidays and ordinary days made extraordinary by the presence of the people I loved. I could have lived anywhere. I owned properties across the city, buildings that housed hundreds of tenants, commercial spaces that brought in monthly rents that would have shocked my son into silence. I could have lived in a penthouse overlooking the river, in a mansion with gardens and a pool, in any of the luxury apartments I had purchased over the years as investments. But I had chosen this place because it reminded me of where Daniel and I had started. Small, simple, full of dreams and possibilities. I looked at the photo on my mantle, the one of Daniel and me on our wedding day. We were so young then, barely 20 years old, standing in front of a tiny chapel in a suit and dress we had borrowed from friends. My bouquet was made of flowers I had picked from a neighbor's garden, with their permission, of course. Daniel's tie was slightly crooked because neither of us knew how to tie one properly back then. I remembered the moment the photographer had snapped that picture. Daniel had leaned over and whispered in my ear, "One day, Eleanor, we're going to have everything, I promise you. One day, we're going to show everyone who doubted us." I had laughed and whispered back, "I already have everything, Daniel. I have you." The memory was so vivid I could almost smell the wildflowers in my bouquet, could almost feel Daniel's warm hand in mine. 42 years had passed since that day, but it felt like yesterday. It felt like a lifetime ago. Both things were true. Everyone said we were crazy to get married so soon, that we had nothing, that we would fail. My own sisters had tried to talk me out of it. My older sister Ruth had pulled me aside a week before the wedding. She had said, "Eleanor, please listen to me. Daniel is a good man, but good intentions don't pay the rent. You're both so young. What's the rush? Wait a few years, save some money, build a foundation first." I had looked at her, at the worry in her eyes, and I had understood where she was coming from. Ruth had married young too, to a man who had promised her the world and delivered nothing but disappointment. She was divorced by 30, raising 2 children on her own, working as a waitress to make ends meet. I had said, "Ruth, I know you're worried, but Daniel is different. I know it in my heart." She had shaken her head, unconvinced. She said, "That's what I thought too, Eleanor. That's what every young woman thinks." My younger brother James had been more supportive, but even he had reservations. He had taken me for a walk the night before the wedding, through the neighborhood where we had grown up. He said, "Eleanor, I'm not going to try to talk you out of this. I know your mind is made up, but I want you to promise me something." I said, "What?" He said, "Promise me that if things get hard, you won't give up." Promise me that you'll fight for what you want, that you won't let circumstances define you. I had looked at my little brother, who wasn't so little anymore, and I had felt a rush of love for him. I said, "I promise, James. I'm a fighter. You know that." He had smiled and said, "I do know that." It's the one thing I've never doubted about you. My mother had cried, not tears of joy, but tears of worry. She had pulled me aside before the ceremony and said, "Eleanor, you're making a mistake. Daniel is a good man, but good men don't pay the bills." You'll struggle your whole life. I had looked at her, at the worry lines on her face, at the gray streaks in her hair that had appeared so early because of the stress of raising 5 children alone after my father left. I understood her fear. I had grown up with that fear, watching her work 3 jobs, watching her sacrifice everything so we could have food on the table and shoes that fit. My mother had been a seamstress, a cleaning lady, and a night shift worker at the local diner. She slept maybe 4 hours a night, and even then, her sleep was restless, filled with worries about money and bills and how she was going to keep a roof over our heads. I remembered lying in bed as a child, listening to her cry in the kitchen when she thought we were all asleep. I remembered the shame I felt when I had to wear the same dress to school 3 days in a row because we couldn't afford to buy new clothes. I remembered the hunger that gnawed at my stomach on the days when there simply wasn't enough food to go around. But I also knew something my mother didn't. I knew that Daniel and I had something special, a partnership that would carry us through whatever challenges came our way. I had said, "Mama, I love him, and we have a plan." She had shaken her head, unconvinced, but she had walked me down the aisle anyway. She had kissed my cheek and whispered, "I hope you know what you're doing, Eleanor. I hope he's worth it." He was. He was worth everything. And in a way, everyone was right about our circumstances. We had nothing. Daniel worked at a factory, operating heavy machinery for 10 hours a day, coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes. His back ached constantly from the physical labor, and his hands were rough with calluses. I worked as a secretary at a small accounting firm, typing letters and answering phones and making coffee for men who never remembered my name. I earned barely enough to cover our share of the rent, but I was determined to contribute, to be a partner in every sense of the word. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that was so tiny we could hear our neighbors arguing through the walls every single night. The couple on the left fought about money, their voices rising and falling in the same predictable rhythms. The man above us played his television too loud until past midnight, and we could hear the canned laughter of sitcoms through our ceiling. The family across the hall had 3 children who ran up and down the hallway like a herd of wild horses, their footsteps shaking the floor. Our bedroom was just big enough for a double bed and a small dresser. Our kitchen had a stove with only 2 working burners and a refrigerator that hummed so loudly we could hear it from every room. Our bathroom had a window that wouldn't close all the way, so in winter we had to stuff towels in the gap to keep out the cold. But we had each other. And we had dreams. I remember the night Daniel came home, his eyes bright with excitement despite the 12-hour shift he had just finished. He sat me down at our tiny kitchen table, the one we had found at a garage sale for $5, and said, "Eleanor, I have an idea. It's crazy, but hear me out." I looked at him, at this man I had married with nothing but love and hope, and I said, "I'm listening." He told me about a piece of land on the outskirts of town. It was cheap because nobody wanted it. It was near the railroad tracks, noisy, considered worthless by everyone who knew anything about real estate. The owner was desperate to sell because he needed the money to pay for his wife's medical bills. He was asking for almost nothing, just enough to cover what he owed. Daniel's eyes were shining as he spoke. He said, "I've been watching, Eleanor. I've been paying attention to things most people don't notice. The city is growing. The new highway they're building is going to change everything. The population is expanding outward, and in 10 years, that worthless piece of land isn't going to be worthless anymore. In 10 years, that land is going to be worth something real." I looked at him, at the hope and determination in his eyes. I had seen that look before, on our wedding day, when he had promised me a future. I said, "How much do we need?" He told me the number. It was almost everything we had saved, every penny we had scraped together over 2 years of marriage. It would mean no safety net, no backup plan, no room for error. It would mean skipping meals and patching clothes and driving our old car until it fell apart. I thought about my mother, about the fear that had defined her entire life. I thought about the choices she had made out of that fear, the opportunities she had missed, the dreams she had let die. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want fear to control my life. I took his hand across the table, feeling the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. I said, "Let's do it." Daniel's face broke into the biggest smile I had ever seen. He said, "Really? You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure. I believe in you, Daniel. I believe in us." That was 40 years ago. We bought that land. And then we bought another piece, a small lot near the old cannery that had closed down. And then another, a strip of property along the new highway that was taking shape just as Daniel had predicted. Daniel kept working at the factory, and I kept working at the accounting firm. We saved every penny we could. We skipped vacations, telling our families that we preferred to stay home. We wore our clothes until they fell apart, and then patched them and wore them some more. We drove the same car for 15 years, learning to fix the engine ourselves when it broke down. People thought we were poor. Our families thought we were struggling. When Marcus was born, my mother came to help and looked around our tiny apartment with tears in her eyes. She said, "Eleanor, you don't have to live like this. I can help you find a better place. You need more room for the baby." I had hugged her and said, "We're fine, Mama. Really. We're happy." She hadn't believed me. She had left shaking her head, convinced that her daughter's life was exactly the struggle she had feared. But what they didn't know, what we never told anyone, was that every spare dollar we had went into buying property. Land. Buildings. Small at first, then larger as our investments paid off and we reinvested everything back into the business. We never took profits. We never treated ourselves to luxuries. Every single return went straight back into buying more, into building something that would last. I learned the business alongside Daniel, studying at night after Marcus was asleep, reading books about real estate law, market analysis, property valuation. I took courses at the community college, telling my family I was learning typing skills to improve my job prospects. The truth was, I was learning how to manage an empire. Daniel and I would sit at our kitchen table long after midnight, going over numbers, analyzing markets, arguing about strategy. We were partners in every sense of the word, each bringing different strengths to our venture. Daniel had vision and intuition. I had patience and attention to detail. He would get excited about a property, his enthusiasm infectious, his certainty absolute. And I would be the one to slow down, to examine the numbers, to make sure we weren't making a mistake. More than once, I had saved us from a bad deal. And more than once, Daniel had pushed me to take a risk that paid off beyond our wildest dreams. By the time Daniel passed away, our portfolio was worth more than $50 million. And I had been the one managing it for the last 20 years, ever since Daniel's health started to decline. It started with small things: forgetfulness, confusion, difficulty finding the right words. At first, we thought it was just stress, the natural effects of aging. But then the symptoms got worse, and we couldn't ignore it anymore. The doctors told us it was early-onset dementia. Daniel was only 55 years old. He had decades of life left to live, but his mind was already beginning to fade. I remember the night he came home from the doctor's office, his face pale, his hands shaking. He sat down on the couch and said, "Eleanor, I'm scared." I sat down next to him and took his hand. I said, "We'll get through this together." "We always have." He looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes for the first time since I had known him. He said, "What if I forget you? What if I forget everything we've built?" I held his face in my hands and said, "Then I'll remember for both of us. I'll remember everything. I promise." Over the years that followed, I watched the man I loved slowly disappear. Some days were better than others. Some days he was almost like his old self, cracking jokes and telling stories and holding my hand as we walked through the park. But other days he didn't recognize me at all. He would look at me with confusion, asking who I was, why I was in his house. Those were the hardest days. Through it all, I managed our business. I negotiated with developers, sitting across the table from men in expensive suits who assumed I was just someone's assistant. I studied the market trends, knowing when to buy and when to sell. I made decisions that grew our portfolio while my husband's mind slowly faded away. I was the one who turned Daniel's initial vision into something beyond what either of us had ever imagined when we were two kids in a tiny apartment, dreaming about a future we could barely see. But Marcus never knew any of this. When Daniel got sick 15 years ago, we made a decision together. We sat in his hospital room, holding hands, watching the sunset through the window, and we talked about what to do. It was one of his good days. He was lucid, present, the Daniel I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Daniel said, "We can't tell Marcus about the money. Not now. Maybe not ever." I looked at him, surprised. I said, "Why not? It's his inheritance. He has a right to know." Daniel shook his head, his hand squeezing mine weakly. He said, "Think about it, Eleanor. Marcus is 25. He's just starting his career in real estate. He thinks he knows everything about the world, about business, about success. He's arrogant, entitled, convinced he's smarter than everyone around him." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Our son had grown up watching us struggle, or so he thought. He had developed a chip on his shoulder, a determination to be better than his parents, to rise above the circumstances of his birth. Daniel continued, "If we tell him now, he'll never become his own man. He'll coast on our money, never learn what it means to work for something, to sacrifice, to build something from nothing. He'll become exactly the kind of person we never wanted him to be." I felt tears streaming down my face. I said, "So, what do we do?" Daniel said, "We keep the secret. We let him build his career, make his own way. learn his own lessons. And someday, when he's ready, when he's become the man we know he can be, we'll tell him the truth, I said. And if he never becomes that man? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the sun had set completely, and the room was bathed in the soft glow of the hospital lights. He said, "Then at least we'll know we gave him the chance to try." I agreed. We set up trusts and holding companies with the help of our lawyer, Patricia Chen, a sharp woman who had been handling our affairs for years. We hid our ownership behind layers of corporate structures, made it impossible for Marcus to ever trace any of it back to us. And then Daniel got sicker, and then he was gone, and I was left alone to carry the secret. The day Daniel died, I sat by his bedside and held his hand. He hadn't recognized me for months, but in his final moments, something shifted. He looked at me with clarity, with love, with the same spark I had seen in his eyes on our wedding day. He said, "Eleanor, my Eleanor." I said, "I'm here, Daniel, I'm here." He said, "Did we do it? Did we build what we dreamed?" I squeezed his hand and said, "Yes, Daniel, we did. We built everything." He smiled and said, "I love you. I always have. I always will." And then he was gone. For 15 years since that day, I watched my son grow his career. I watched him climb the ranks at the real estate firm, celebrating each promotion, each deal, each new client. I listened to him brag about his accomplishments, about how he had built everything himself, about how he owed nothing to anyone. I bit my tongue. I smiled and nodded and told him how proud I was. Because I was proud. Despite everything, despite his arrogance and his dismissiveness, he was my son. He was smart and driven and capable. He just didn't know where that drive came from, didn't understand that it was the same fire that had burned in Daniel and me all those years ago. What Marcus didn't know was that the house he lived in, the beautiful 4-bedroom home in the nicest neighborhood in the city, was owned by one of my holding companies. He paid rent every month, never knowing that his rent checks went straight into an account with my name on it. The property management company he dealt with was staffed by people who had no idea who actually owned the building. They just followed instructions, collected rent, handled maintenance requests. What Marcus didn't know was that the real estate firm he worked for, the one he was so proud of, the one he bragged about to everyone who would listen, was partially funded by an investment I had made 8 years ago, when the original owners were struggling to stay afloat. They had been good men, honest business people who had hit a rough patch during the recession. I had provided the capital they needed to survive, asking only for a stake in the company in return. What Marcus didn't know was that the 2 luxury cars in his driveway, the ones he had leased through a special program his company offered, were actually owned by another one of my subsidiaries. The leasing company was one of several businesses I had acquired over the years, part of a diversified portfolio that included everything from commercial real estate to retail strips to industrial properties. My son had built his entire life on a foundation I had created, and he had no idea. For years I had told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was doing well, that he was happy, that he was successful. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need credit. I just needed to know that my son was okay. But that night, standing in his hallway, listening to him call me a failure, something broke inside me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the moon rise over the park, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, watching the world continue on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. I thought about Daniel, about what he would say if he could see our son now. I thought about our decision to keep the secret, about whether it had been the right choice, about whether we had protected Marcus or enabled him. I thought about my own mother, who had raised 5 children on her own after my father left. She had worked 3 jobs, never complained, never asked for anything. She had taught me that strength wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up. Day after day, year after year, no matter what. I had tried to teach Marcus the same lesson, but somewhere along the way, I had failed. Not because I hadn't worked hard enough, but because I had hidden too much. I had protected him from the truth, thinking I was helping him become independent. Instead, I had allowed him to become someone who looked down on the very people who had given him everything. I had allowed him to become someone I didn't recognize anymore, someone I didn't particularly like. The next morning, I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, her voice professional and warm. She said, "Eleanor, good morning." "What can I do for you?" I said. "Patricia, I need you to prepare some documents for me. It's time my son learned the truth." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia knew about Marcus. She knew about our decision to keep him in the dark. She had advised us years ago to set up the trusts and holding companies in a way that would keep our identities hidden. Patricia said, "Are you sure about this, Eleanor? Once he knows, there's no going back. This is information that will change his entire understanding of his life." I looked out at the park, at the children playing on the swings, at the mothers watching from the benches. I thought about all the mornings I had spent in that same park with Marcus when he was little, pushing him on those same swings, dreaming about the man he would become. I had imagined him kind. I had imagined him grateful. I had imagined him looking at me with love and respect, understanding everything I had done for him. I had never imagined this. I said, "I'm sure." Patricia said, "All right. I'll have everything ready by the end of the week. What's the occasion? Is there a specific reason for the timing?" I smiled, though there was no joy in it. I said, "Marcus is having a dinner party on Saturday, some big celebration for his company's anniversary. He invited me, probably out of obligation. I think it's the perfect time to make an announcement." Patricia was quiet for a moment. I could hear her thinking, weighing her words carefully. She said, "Eleanor, I've known you for a long time, over 15 years now. You're not the kind of person who does things for revenge. You're measured, thoughtful, strategic. What's really going on here?" I thought about her question. Was this revenge? Was I doing this to hurt Marcus? To humiliate him the way he had humiliated me? I said, "Patricia, my son thinks I'm a failure. He thinks I've never accomplished anything in my life. He's built his entire identity on the belief that he did everything on his own, that he owes nothing to anyone, especially not to me." I paused, gathering my thoughts. I continued, "I'm not doing this to punish him. I'm doing this because I love him. And because I've realized that by hiding the truth, I haven't protected him. I've enabled him. I've allowed him to become someone who looks down on others, who judges people by their appearance, who measures worth in terms of money and status." I took a deep breath. I said, "He called me a failure, Patricia, in front of his friends and colleagues. He said I had never accomplished anything in my life. He said he was embarrassed by me." I heard Patricia's sharp intake of breath. She said, "Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry." I said, "Don't be sorry. Be prepared. I want every document ready, every piece of evidence organized." "When I tell my son the truth, I want there to be no room for doubt." Patricia said, "And you think the truth will change him?" I said, I don't know. But I know that lies haven't helped. I've been lying to him his whole life, letting him believe a story that made him think he was better than everyone else. Maybe the truth will be the shock he needs. Or maybe it won't change anything at all. My voice caught. I said, but either way, I'm done hiding. I'm done being invisible. I'm done being treated like I don't matter by my own son. Patricia said, I understand. I'll have everything ready by Friday. Do you want me to be there on Saturday? As a witness? Or for moral support? I considered it. I said, no. This is something I need to do alone. But thank you for offering. Patricia said, Eleanor, whatever happens, I want you to know that I've always admired you. What you and Daniel built, the way you've managed it all these years, it's remarkable. You're one of the most impressive people I've ever worked with. I felt tears prick at my eyes. I said, thank you, Patricia. That means more than you know. The next few days passed slowly. I went about my routine, visiting the farmer's market on Tuesday, having lunch with my friend Miriam on Wednesday, attending my book club on Thursday. But my mind was elsewhere, constantly returning to Saturday, to what I was about to do. Miriam noticed something was wrong during our lunch. We were at our usual restaurant, a small Italian place we had been coming to for 20 years, sitting at our usual table by the window. Miriam looked at me over her plate of pasta and said, Eleanor, you're 1,000 miles away. What's going on? I hesitated. Miriam was my oldest friend, the one person besides Daniel who had known about our investments. She had kept our secret for decades, never telling a soul. I said, something happened with Marcus. Miriam's face tightened. She had never been a fan of my son's attitude. She said, what did he do now? I told her about the dinner party, about standing in the hallway, about the things Marcus had said. As I spoke, Miriam's expression shifted from concern to anger. When I finished, she said, that ungrateful little... I can't believe him. After everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed. I said, he doesn't know what I've sacrificed. That's the problem. Miriam said, then tell him. Tell him everything. Let him see what a fool he's been. I said, that's what I'm planning to do, on Saturday. Miriam's eyes widened. She said, at his dinner party? In front of all his fancy friends? I nodded. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across her face. She said, Eleanor Mitchell, I have known you for 40 years, and I have never seen this side of you. I am absolutely here for it. I couldn't help but laugh, the first real laugh I had managed since that terrible night. I said, I'm terrified, Miriam. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Miriam reached across the table and took my hand. She said, you're doing the only thing you can do. You've protected that boy his whole life, and look where it's gotten you. It's time for some truth, even if it hurts. I squeezed her hand gratefully. I said, what if it destroys our relationship completely? What if he never speaks to me again? Miriam said, then at least you'll know you tried. At least you'll have your dignity back. At least he'll know who his mother really is. On Friday evening, I received a call from Marcus. It was the first time he had called me in weeks, and my heart jumped when I saw his name on the screen. For one foolish moment, I thought maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe someone had told him I had heard everything. Maybe he had realized what he had done. He said, Mom, just confirming you're coming tomorrow night. It starts at 7. I said, I'll be there. He said, great. Oh, and Mom, try to dress nicely, okay? These are important people. Business partners, investors, that kind of thing. I don't want you showing up in one of your old cardigans. I wanted to laugh, or cry. I wasn't sure which. I said, I'll do my best, Marcus. He said, and don't stay too late, okay? I know you like to hang around, but this isn't really a family event. It's professional. I gripped the phone tighter. I said, I understand. He said, actually, you know what? Maybe it would be better if you came by earlier, before the main event. We could have coffee or something. That way you don't have to stay for the whole dinner. I closed my eyes. He was trying to get rid of me, to minimize my presence at his celebration. I said, Marcus, I would like to attend the dinner, if that's all right with you. He sighed. He said, Fine, just try not to embarrass me, okay? He hung up without saying goodbye, without saying he loved me, without saying anything that a son should say to his mother. I set the phone down and looked at the folder Patricia had delivered that afternoon. It contained everything: property deeds, investment records, corporate documents, financial statements. The full picture of what Daniel and I had built over 4 decades. Tomorrow, Marcus would finally see it all. Saturday arrived, and I spent the afternoon getting ready. I chose a simple black dress, elegant but understated. It was designer, though no one would know by looking at it. I had bought it years ago for Daniel's funeral, the kind of quality that lasted. I wore the pearl necklace Daniel had given me for our 30th anniversary, the one I had designed with a custom jeweler using diamonds from my grandmother's ring. It was the most valuable piece of jewelry I owned, worth more than most people's cars, but it looked simple enough that no one would give it a second glance. I did my hair carefully, applied a touch of makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror, at the 62-year-old woman with silver hair and lines around her eyes. I didn't look like a failure. I looked like someone who had lived a full life, who had loved and lost and survived. I picked up the folder and tucked it into a large purse. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I drove to Marcus's house, the house I technically owned, and parked on the street. There were already several cars in the driveway, expensive ones. His colleagues, his friends, all the people he was trying so hard to impress. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Marcus opened the door. He was wearing a tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked successful, confident, every inch the man he wanted the world to see. He looked at me and his smile faltered, just for a moment. He said, Mom, you came. I said, Of course I came. You invited me. He stepped aside to let me in, and I walked into the house I had purchased 12 years ago when Marcus was just starting his career. I remembered signing the papers, setting up the lease agreement through the holding company, making sure the rent was affordable for a young man just starting out. I had wanted to help him without him knowing. I had wanted to give him a foundation without undermining his sense of accomplishment. I had thought I was being clever, being supportive, being a good mother. Now I wondered if I had just been a fool. The living room was full of people. I recognized some of them from the hallway incident, including the blonde woman who had asked what I did for a living. She was wearing another expensive dress, laughing at something someone had said, her hand resting on the arm of a man I didn't recognize. Marcus led me to a corner and leaned in close. He said quietly, Mom, please try not to embarrass me tonight, okay? These are important clients and partners. The future of my career depends on impressing these people. I looked at him, at this man I had raised, and I felt a strange mixture of love and sadness. I said, Marcus, have I ever embarrassed you? He laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. He said, Mom, just stay quiet, okay? Let me handle things. If someone asks what you do, just say you're retired. Don't go into details. I nodded and he walked away, immediately transforming into the charming, confident businessman he showed to the world. I watched him work the room, shaking hands, telling jokes, accepting compliments. He was good at this, I had to admit. He had charisma, a natural ability to make people feel important. He had learned that from Daniel, who had always been able to talk to anyone about anything. But I also saw the cracks. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The way he tensed up whenever anyone mentioned family. The way he avoided looking in my direction, as if my very presence was a source of shame. I found a seat in the corner and watched. A waiter offered me a glass of champagne, and I accepted it gratefully. I needed something to steady my nerves. I looked around the room at the elegant decorations, the expensive furniture, the tasteful artwork on the walls. Everything in this house was designed to impress, to project an image of success and sophistication. And yet, none of it was truly Marcus's. The house was mine. The furniture had been purchased with credit extended by one of my subsidiary companies. Even the caterers had been recommended by a contact I had cultivated years ago. My son lived in a world I had created, walking on floors I had paid for, eating from dishes bought with my money, and he had no idea. A man approached me, older, with kind eyes and silver hair like mine. There was something about his face that suggested intelligence, wisdom, a lifetime of careful observation. He said, "You must be Marcus's mother. I'm Harold Chen. I was a judge for 30 years before I retired." I shook his hand and said, "Eleanor Mitchell." "It's nice to meet you." Harold sat down in the chair next to me and said, "I've known Marcus for about 5 years now. He's quite the rising star in the business." I said, "Yes, he's worked very hard." Harold studied me with curious eyes. There was an intelligence there, a perceptiveness that came from years of evaluating people. I had the feeling he saw more than he let on. He said, "Forgive me for saying so, but you don't quite fit the picture Marcus has painted." I felt my heart skip. I said, "What do you mean?" Harold smiled gently. He said, "Marcus has always presented himself as entirely self-made. No family support, no advantages, just raw determination and hard work. But watching you walk in tonight, the way you carry yourself, the way you observe the room, you remind me of the most formidable people I've ever encountered in my courtroom, people who know more than they say." I felt a chill run down my spine. This man was dangerous, in the way that perceptive people always are. I said, "I'm just an old woman who came to support her son." Harold nodded, but his eyes told me he didn't believe a word. He said, "You know, I've learned over the years that the quietest people in the room are often the most interesting. Care to share more about yourself, Eleanor?" I smiled and said, "There's not much to tell. I'm retired now. I read a lot. I garden. I spend time with friends." Harold said, "And before retirement, what did you do?" I hesitated. This was the question I had been dodging for years. I said, "I managed some investments, property mostly." Harold nodded appreciatively. He said, "Real estate? Interesting. The family business, then?" I said, "In a way." Before Harold could ask more questions, Marcus stood up at the head of the table and clinked his glass. He said, "Everyone, thank you so much for being here tonight. As you know, this marks the 10th anniversary of my company, and I couldn't have done it without all of you." There was polite applause. Marcus continued, "When I started in this business, I had nothing. No connections, no family money, no safety net. Everything I have, everything you see around you, I built with my own 2 hands." I felt my jaw tighten. I gripped the folder in my lap. He said, "My parents were simple people. My father worked in a factory his whole life. My mother never worked a day outside the home. They did their best, I suppose, but they never understood ambition. They never understood what it takes to succeed in this world." I saw a few people glance in my direction, uncomfortable. Harold, next to me, shifted in his seat. Marcus said, "But I didn't let my background hold me back. I made something of myself. And tonight, I want to celebrate not just the company's success, but the power of determination, of refusing to accept the limitations others try to place on you." He raised his glass. He said, "To success, to hard work, to building something from nothing." The room echoed, "To success." I sat there, my glass untouched, my heart pounding. This was the moment. This was why I had come. I stood up. The movement caught attention, and a few people turned to look at me. Marcus frowned. He said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I said, "Marcus, may I say a few words?" He looked panicked. His eyes darted around the room, assessing the damage. He said, "Mom, now isn't really the time. We're in the middle of dinner." I said, "It will only take a moment, I promise." The room was silent, watching the exchange. Marcus couldn't refuse without looking terrible, and he knew it. He forced a smile and said, "Of course, Mom. Go ahead." I walked to the head of the table, my folder tucked under my arm. I stood next to Marcus, who was practically vibrating with anxiety. I said, "Good evening, everyone. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm Marcus's mother, as he mentioned, the housewife who never accomplished anything." There was an uncomfortable ripple of nervous laughter. I continued, "I want to tell you a story. It's a story about two young people who got married 42 years ago with nothing but love and dreams. A factory worker and a secretary, living in a tiny apartment, saving every penny they could." I looked at Marcus. His face was a mask, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. I said, "My husband Daniel had a vision. He believed in buying land, in investing in the future, in thinking long-term when everyone else was focused on the short term, and I believed in him." I opened my folder and pulled out the first document. I said, "This is the deed to the first piece of property we ever bought, a worthless piece of land near the railroad tracks. We paid $2,000 for it in 1983. I pulled out another document. I said, "We sold that land 15 years later for $400,000, and we used that money to buy more property, and more, and more." The room was completely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. I said, "Over the years, Daniel and I built a real estate portfolio worth more than $50 million. We did it quietly, without fanfare, without ever telling anyone. Not our families, not our friends, not even our son." I looked at Marcus. His face had gone pale. I said, "When Daniel got sick, I took over the management of our holdings. I negotiated deals, I analyzed markets, I made decisions that grew our portfolio by another 30% over the last decade." I pulled out another document. I said, "This is the ownership record for this house. The house we're standing in right now. It's owned by Mitchell Holdings, LLC. I am the sole owner of Mitchell Holdings, LLC." Marcus's mouth opened, but no words came out. I said, "You've been paying rent on this house for 12 years, Marcus. Every single check has gone into an account that I control." I pulled out more documents. I said, "These are the investment records for your company. When it was struggling 8 years ago, when the original owners were about to go under, I provided the capital that kept it afloat." Through a series of holding companies, I own 23% of the firm you've been running." Marcus finally found his voice. He said, That's not possible." I said, "It is. Patricia Chen, my lawyer, can verify everything. Every document, every transaction, every ownership record. I have the paperwork right here if anyone would like to review it." I looked around the room at the stunned faces. The blonde woman's mouth was hanging open. Harold was nodding slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. I said, "I'm not telling you this to humiliate my son. I'm telling you this because Marcus has built his identity on a lie. The lie that he did everything himself, that he owes nothing to anyone, that his parents were failures who never accomplished anything." I turned back to Marcus. I said, "The truth is, everything you have, everything you've built, has been supported by a foundation your father and I created. You didn't know it, and that was our choice. We wanted you to learn the value of hard work. We wanted you to become your own man." My voice cracked slightly. I said, "But somewhere along the way, you became someone who looks down on others, someone who dismisses people based on appearances, Someone who calls his own mother a failure because she doesn't drive a fancy car or live in a big house. I reached into my folder one more time and pulled out a final document. I said, "This is my will. In its current form, when I die, everything I own, all $53 million of it, will go to charity. Every penny. Marcus will receive nothing." There was an audible gasp from several people in the room. Marcus stepped forward, his face red. He said, "Mom, you can't be serious." I said, "I'm completely serious. I've given you everything your whole life, Marcus. I gave you love, support, opportunities, financial backing you never even knew about. And in return, you've given me contempt, embarrassment, shame." I placed the documents on the table. I said, "I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I love you and because I've failed you. Not by being a housewife, not by staying home to raise you, but by hiding the truth. By letting you believe a story that made you think you were better than everyone else." I looked at the faces around the room. I said, "I hope that one day, Marcus, you'll understand why I did what I did. I hope that one day you'll see that strength isn't about what you own or what title you have. It's about how you treat people. All people. Including the ones who don't seem important." I picked up my purse from the chair where I had left it. I said, "I'll let myself out. Thank you all for listening. Enjoy the rest of your evening." I walked through the silent room, past the stunned guests, past my son who stood frozen at the head of his table in his expensive suit, and I let myself out the front door. The night air was cool on my face as I walked to my car. My hands were shaking, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could find my keys. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, not moving. I had done it. After all these years, I had finally told the truth. But I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt empty. I felt scared. I felt like I had just detonated a bomb in the middle of my relationship with my only child. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the city. I passed the building where Daniel and I had lived when we were first married. It had been renovated now, turned into expensive loft apartments. But I could still see the ghost of our first home, the tiny windows where I used to watch for Daniel coming home from work. I passed the lot where we had bought our first piece of property, now home to a shopping center that brought in over $100,000 a year in rent. I passed the hospital where Marcus had been born, where I had held him for the first time and promised him the world. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in my chair by the window and cried. I cried for Daniel, who wasn't here to see what our son had become. I cried for Marcus, the little boy who used to run into my arms when I picked him up from school. I cried for myself, for all the years I had spent in the shadows, building and supporting and never asking for anything in return. I didn't hear from Marcus that night, or the next day, or the day after that. A week passed, then two. I went about my routine, but everything felt different. The farmer's market didn't seem as colorful. My book club discussions didn't engage me the way they usually did. Even my garden, which had always been my sanctuary, felt like just a collection of plants. Miriam came over for lunch one afternoon and found me sitting in my chair, staring out the window. She said, "Eleanor, you've barely touched your food. What's wrong?" I turned to look at her. I said, "It's been 2 weeks, Miriam." "He hasn't called. He hasn't visited. Nothing." Miriam sat down across from me. She said, "Give him time, Eleanor. You dropped a bomb on his entire understanding of his life. He needs to process." I said, "What if he never forgives me?" Miriam said, "Then at least you'll know you told the truth. At least you'll have your integrity." I said, "What good is integrity if I lose my son?" Miriam was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you regret it?" I thought about the question. Did I regret it? I said, I regret that it came to this. I regret that I let it go on for so long. But no, I don't regret telling the truth. Miriam said, and the will? Do you really intend to leave everything to charity? I said, I don't know. I said it in the heat of the moment to make a point. But maybe it's not about the money at all. Maybe it's about giving Marcus the chance to become someone different, someone better. Miriam nodded. She said, You know, Eleanor, you're one of the strongest people I've ever known. Not because of the money, but because of who you are. The way you handle things, the way you keep going, no matter what. I looked at my old friend, at her kind face and knowing eyes. I said, I don't feel strong, Miriam. I feel like a mother who failed her son. Miriam took my hand. She said, You didn't fail him, Eleanor. You gave him the tools. What he does with them is his choice. 3 weeks after the dinner party, there was a knock at my door. My heart jumped. I walked to the door slowly, afraid to hope. I opened it to find Marcus standing there. He looked different than I had ever seen him. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. There were dark circles under his eyes and his face was pale and drawn. He said, Mom, can I come in? I stepped aside and let him enter. He walked into my small living room and looked around, as if seeing it for the first time. He said, I never understood why you lived here. I thought you were just too proud to ask for help, that you were being stubborn about accepting money from me. I said, I never needed help, Marcus. I chose this place because I like it. It reminds me of where your father and I started. He turned to face me, and I could see that he had been crying. His eyes were red, his face drawn. He said, I've been thinking, a lot, about everything you said at the party, about everything I said before that. He paused, struggling with his words. He said, I was so angry at first. I felt betrayed. Like you and Dad had been lying to me my whole life. Like everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong. I said, we were trying to protect you. He said, I know that now, but it took me a while to get there. He sat down on my sofa, running his hands through his hair. He said, I've spent the last 3 weeks going through everything, all the documents you left, all the records. I hired my own lawyer, my own accountant to verify everything because I couldn't believe it. He looked up at me. He said, It's all true. Every word. You and Dad built all of that, and I never knew. I never even suspected. I sat down across from him, in my chair by the window. I said, Your father wanted it that way. He thought if you knew, you wouldn't push yourself. You wouldn't learn what it means to work for something. Marcus laughed, but it was a bitter, broken sound. He said, The irony is, I thought I was working hard. I thought I was building something from nothing. But the whole time, I was standing on a foundation you created. I said, You still worked hard, Marcus. You still built something. The foundation was there, but you had to do the building. He shook his head. He said, That's generous of you, Mom. But we both know the truth. If you hadn't invested in my company, it would have failed. If you hadn't provided that house at below market rent, I never could have afforded to live in that neighborhood, to make the connections I needed. Everything I thought I earned. I didn't earn it all. I leaned forward. I said, Marcus, listen to me. What matters isn't where you started or what advantages you had. What matters is what you do with what you're given. You had opportunities, yes, but you also worked hard, made smart decisions, built relationships. That's not nothing. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. He said, How can you be so understanding? After everything I said, after the way I treated you, I called you a failure, Mom, in front of everyone. I was ashamed of you. I felt tears prick at my eyes. I said, Because you're my son. Because I love you. Because I remember the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and tell me they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. Because I remember you at 5 years old, holding my hand as we walked through the park, asking me a million questions about everything you saw. Marcus's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands, and I watched my 40-year-old son cry like the child he used to be. I moved to sit beside him on the sofa. I put my arm around his shoulders, the way I used to when he was small and had scraped his knee or had a bad dream. He said through his tears, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything I said, for the way I acted, for being ashamed of you. You're the most accomplished person I know, and I treated you like you were nothing." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be different." I said, "You don't have to know right now. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one choice at a time, one day at a time." He sat up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He said, "The will. Are you really going to leave everything to charity?" I said, "I haven't decided yet. That depends on a lot of things." He nodded, accepting this. He said, "I wouldn't blame you if you did. I don't deserve any of it." I said, "It's not about deserving, Marcus. It's about becoming. The question isn't whether you deserve the money now. The question is whether you'll become someone who uses it well." He looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. He said, "How did you do it, Mom? How did you and Dad build all of that without anyone knowing?" I smiled, remembering. I said, "Patience, discipline, and a lot of trust in each other. We were a team, your father and I. We made every decision together, supported each other through every setback, celebrated every victory together." I told him the story then, the real story, not the version he had imagined. I told him about the early years, the sacrifices, the risks. I told him about the first property, the land near the railroad tracks that everyone said was worthless. I told him about the failures, the properties that didn't work out, the deals that fell through. I told him about the time we almost lost everything during a recession, how Daniel and I had stayed up for 3 days straight, renegotiating with banks, selling off assets, finding a way to survive. I told him about the nights Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table going over numbers, arguing about strategy, dreaming about the future. I told him about our rule. Every major decision had to be unanimous. If one of us had doubts, we didn't move forward. I told him about the day we realized we had crossed the $1 million mark, how we had celebrated with a bottle of cheap champagne and promised each other that the money would never change who we were. I told him about managing everything alone after Daniel got sick, about the fear and the responsibility, and the determination to honor everything we had built together. I told him about the nights I cried myself to sleep, missing my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. Marcus listened in silence, absorbing every word. When I finished, he said, "I never knew any of this. I never asked." I said, "You never seemed interested." He flinched at that, but he didn't argue. He said, "I want to know more. I want to understand. Not just about the business, but about you and Dad. About your lives before I came along. About who you were before you were my parents." I looked at my son, at this man I had raised, and I felt a small spark of hope. I said, "I would like that." Over the next few months, things began to change. Marcus came to visit every week, sometimes twice a week. We would sit in my small living room drinking tea, and I would tell him stories. Stories about his father, about our early years, about the struggles and the triumphs. I showed him the photo albums I had kept, the ones he had never been interested in before. I showed him pictures of Daniel as a young man, handsome and hopeful, his eyes full of dreams. I showed him pictures of myself, before the gray hair and the wrinkles, when I was just a girl with big dreams and no idea how to achieve them. I showed him pictures of our wedding, our first apartment, our first property. I showed him the progression of our life together, the slow and steady building of something that had lasted. Marcus began to open up too. He told me about the pressure he had felt his whole life, the need to prove himself, the fear of failure. He told me about the loneliness of success, how empty it felt to have everything and no one to share it with. He said, "I think I pushed people away because I was afraid they would see through me, see that I wasn't as impressive as I pretended to be. I was so focused on appearing successful that I forgot to actually become someone worth admiring." I said, "We all feel like that sometimes." The difference is whether we let that fear control us or whether we find the courage to be authentic. He started making changes in his life. He reached out to old friends he had dismissed. He began treating his employees differently, with more respect and appreciation. He even started volunteering at a local mentorship program for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. I saw glimpses of the man I had always hoped he would become: kind, thoughtful, aware of others. One evening, about 6 months after the dinner party, Marcus came to visit with someone unexpected. He knocked on my door, and when I opened it, there was a young woman standing beside him. She was pretty, with dark hair and warm brown eyes, and she looked nervous. Marcus said, "Mom, I want you to meet someone. This is Lucia. We've been seeing each other for a couple of months." I looked at my son, at the genuine smile on his face, at the way he held Lucia's hand. I said, "It's lovely to meet you, Lucia. Please, come in." Over dinner, I learned that Lucia was a social worker. She had grown up in foster care, moved between homes throughout her childhood, worked her way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs, and now spent her days helping children who were in the same situation she had been in. She was nothing like the women Marcus had dated before, the ones who were impressed by his money and his status. Lucia didn't seem to care about any of that. She asked about Daniel, about our story, about the values we had tried to instill in Marcus. She said, "Mrs. Mitchell, Marcus has told me so much about what you and his father built. It's incredible, but I'm more impressed by the way you raised him. He's becoming a wonderful man." I looked at Marcus, who was blushing slightly. I said, "He's always had it in him. It just took him a while to find it." After Lucia left, Marcus stayed behind. He helped me wash the dishes, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He said, "What do you think of her?" I said, "I think she's wonderful. I think she's exactly what you need." He smiled, a real smile, not the charming mask he wore for the world. He said, "I think so too." She sees through all my pretenses, all the things I used to think were important. She doesn't care about the money or the status. She cares about who I actually am. I said, "That's the best kind of love, Marcus, the kind that sees the real you." A year passed, then 2. Marcus and Lucia got engaged, then married in a small ceremony in my garden. I walked him down the aisle, since Daniel wasn't there to do it. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining through the trees, flowers blooming everywhere I looked. Lucia wore a simple white dress, and Marcus wore a suit that had belonged to Daniel. I had altered it myself, making small adjustments so it would fit perfectly. At the reception, Marcus gave a speech. He talked about Lucia, about how she had changed his life. But then he turned to me. He said, "I want to say something about my mother. For most of my life, I didn't appreciate her. I was ashamed of her, if I'm being honest. I thought she was just a housewife who had never accomplished anything. The guests were silent, watching. He continued, I was wrong. My mother is one of the most extraordinary people I have ever known. She and my father built something amazing, something that took vision and courage and sacrifice, and they did it without ever asking for recognition or praise. He looked at me, his eyes bright with tears. He said, Mom, I'm sorry it took me so long to see you for who you really are. You're not a failure. You're a hero. My hero. I couldn't speak. I could only stand there, tears streaming down my face, as my son walked over and wrapped me in his arms. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the caterers had cleaned up, I sat in my garden with Marcus and Lucia. Marcus said, Mom, I've been thinking about the will. I said, What about it? He said, I don't want the money. I don't need it. I have enough. More than enough. He paused, gathering his thoughts. He continued, But I've been thinking about what you said, about becoming someone who would use it well, and I have an idea. I waited for him to continue. He said, What if we set up a foundation, in your name and Dad's name? We could use the money to help young people, people like Lucia was, kids who don't have the advantages I had. We could give them scholarships, mentorship, resources to build their own futures. Lucia nodded enthusiastically. She said, There are so many kids out there who just need a chance, someone to believe in them. Someone to give them the opportunity to prove themselves. I looked at my son, at this man who had grown so much in the past 2 years. I said, That's a beautiful idea, Marcus. Lucia's eyes were shining with excitement. She said, We've already started researching how other foundations work, what makes them successful, what mistakes to avoid. We want to do this right, Mrs. Mitchell. We want to honor everything you and your husband built. I reached over and took Marcus's hand. He said, I want to run it, with Lucia. I want to spend the rest of my life doing something that matters, something that would make you and Dad proud. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I said, Marcus, the fact that you want to do this, the fact that you're thinking about others instead of yourself, that already makes me proud. Your father would be over the moon. Marcus squeezed my hand. He said, I've wasted so much time, Mom. So many years focused on the wrong things, caring about what people thought of me, trying to impress people who didn't matter. Lucia put her hand on his shoulder. She said, You can't change the past, Marcus, but you can change the future. That's what matters now. Marcus nodded. He said, I want to name it after both of you, the Daniel and Eleanor Mitchell Foundation. Is that okay? I couldn't speak for a moment. The thought of our names together, forever linked to something good, something that would help young people for generations to come, was almost too much to bear. I finally said, I think your father would have liked that very much. We spent the next several months planning, organizing, setting up the legal structure of the foundation. Patricia was invaluable, helping us navigate the complex world of nonprofit law, making sure everything was done properly. Marcus and Lucia poured their hearts into the project. They met with educators, social workers, and former foster youth to understand what kind of support would make the biggest difference. They researched successful scholarship programs and mentorship initiatives. They created a comprehensive plan that would not only provide financial assistance, but also ongoing support, guidance, and encouragement. I watched them work together, and I saw something beautiful forming. Not just a foundation, but a partnership, a shared purpose that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as we were reviewing the final documents, Marcus looked up at me. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I said, "What is it?" He took a deep breath. He said, "I've been thinking about that night, the dinner party, the things I said about you to my colleagues." I felt my heart clench. We hadn't talked about that night directly since he had come to my apartment 3 weeks after the party. Marcus continued, "I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times. The words I used, the way I dismissed everything you and Dad had done. I was so blind, Mom, so arrogant." I said, "Marcus, we don't have to talk about this." He said, "No, I need to. I need you to know that I understand now. I understand how much those words must have hurt you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for them." I reached over and touched his face, the way I used to when he was a little boy. I said, "The fact that you understand, the fact that you're sitting here with me now, building something beautiful, that's all the apology I need. You're already making up for it, Marcus. Every single day." He pulled me into a hug, and for a long moment, we just held each other. When we finally pulled apart, Lucia was wiping tears from her eyes. She said, "You two are going to make me cry again." Marcus laughed, the sound full of joy. He said, "Get used to it. This family cries a lot." I smiled and said, "We always have. It's how we know we care." I reached over and took his hand. I said, "Marcus, your father would be so proud of you right now. I am so proud of you." He squeezed my hand. He said, "I'm proud of you too, Mom. I should have said it a long time ago." That night, after Marcus and Lucia had gone home, I sat in my chair by the window and looked up at the stars. I thought about Daniel, about our journey together, about all the dreams we had shared. I said, quietly, to the empty room, "We did good, Daniel. Our boy is going to be okay." The next morning, I called Patricia. I said, "Patricia, I need to make some changes to my will." She said, "I thought you might. What did you have in mind?" I told her about the foundation, about Marcus's idea, about the new future we were building together. Patricia said, "Eleanor, I have to say, when you came to me 2 years ago, I wasn't sure this was going to work out. I thought you might be making a mistake, throwing away your relationship with your son for the sake of the truth." I said, "And now?" She said, "Now I think you're one of the wisest people I've ever met. You took a risk, and it paid off." I smiled. I said, "I had a good teacher. Daniel always said that the best investments aren't in property or stocks, they're in people." Patricia said, "He was right." Over the next few years, we built the foundation together. The Mitchell Family Foundation started small, offering scholarships to 5 students in the first year. I remember the day we announced our first scholarship recipients. We held a small ceremony at the community center, nothing fancy, just a room with folding chairs and a podium. But the faces of those 5 young people, the hope and determination in their eyes, made it feel like the most important event of my life. There was Maria, a 17-year-old who had been in foster care since she was 6. She wanted to be a doctor, to help children who had been through trauma like she had. There was James, an 18-year-old whose single mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, of building things that would last. There was Keisha, who had lost both parents in a car accident and was being raised by her grandmother. She wanted to study law, to fight for families like hers. There was Tommy, a quiet young man with a gift for mathematics who had never been able to afford tutoring or test prep. And there was Alicia, a brilliant girl from the wrong side of town who had been told her whole life that she would never amount to anything. I looked at each of them and saw myself. I saw Daniel. I saw the young people we had been, full of dreams and determination, willing to work harder than anyone else to make something of ourselves. After the ceremony, Maria came up to me. Her eyes were bright with tears. She said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't know how to thank you. No one has ever believed in me like this before." I took her hands and said, "You don't have to thank me, Maria. Just make the most of this opportunity. Work hard, stay focused, and one day, when you're able, help someone else the way we're helping you." She nodded, her face serious. She said, "I will. I promise." And she did. 3 years later, Maria graduated at the top of her class. She went on to medical school, and today she works at a children's hospital, helping young patients navigate trauma and heal. Each of our scholarship recipients had their own story, their own journey. Some struggled, some faltered, some needed extra support along the way. But we were there for all of them, not just with money, but with guidance, encouragement, and the kind of belief that can change a life. Marcus threw himself into the work with a passion I had never seen in him before. He would spend hours on the phone with our scholars, helping them with job applications, practicing interview skills, talking through difficult decisions. He became a mentor, a friend, a father figure to young people who had never had anyone to look up to. One evening I overheard him on a call with one of our scholars, a young man named David who was struggling with his first semester at college. Marcus said, "David, I know it's hard. I know you feel like you don't belong, but let me tell you something. I spent most of my life thinking I was better than everyone else. I thought success was about money and status and looking good in front of the right people." He paused, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. He continued, "I was wrong. Success is about who you become, not what you have. It's about the people you help, the lives you touch, the difference you make in the world. You have a chance to become someone amazing, David. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't." I stood in the doorway, tears streaming down my face, watching my son become the man I had always hoped he could be. By the 5th year, we were supporting over 100 young people across the country, providing not just financial assistance, but mentorship, guidance, and the kind of support that can change a life. Marcus threw himself into the work with a passion I had never seen in him before. He stepped back from his real estate firm, handing over the day-to-day operations to a trusted partner, and devoted most of his time to the foundation. Lucia was beside him every step of the way, using her experience as a social worker to shape our programs and make sure we were reaching the people who needed help the most. I watched my son become the man I had always hoped he could be. Not because of the money, not because of the success, but because he had finally learned what really mattered. On my 70th birthday, Marcus and Lucia threw me a party. It wasn't a big affair, just close friends and family gathered in my garden. The garden where I had married off my son. The garden where I had spent countless hours finding peace and solace. Marcus stood up to give a toast. He said, 70 years ago, a baby girl was born to parents who didn't have much. She grew up to marry a factory worker, to raise a son, to build a fortune in secret, and to never, ever ask for anything in return. He looked at me, his eyes full of love. He said, "Happy birthday, Mom. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. And thank you for being the best mother a son could ever have." I stood up, my joints protesting slightly, and hugged my son. I said, "Thank you for becoming the man your father always knew you could be." As I looked around at the faces gathered in my garden, at the friends I had made over a lifetime, at the family I had built, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent so many years in the shadows, building quietly, supporting silently, never asking for recognition. I had watched my son grow and succeed and fail and grow again. I had grieved my husband and carried on his legacy. I had faced my son's contempt and found the courage to tell the truth. And now, at 70 years old, I was surrounded by love. That evening, as the sun set over my garden, I walked through the flowers with my grandson in my arms. Little Daniel, named after the man who had started it all, was just 6 months old, with his father's eyes and his grandmother's stubborn chin. I held him close and whispered, "Your great-grandpa would have loved you so much. He would have told you stories about the old days, about the dreams he had when he was young, about the woman he loved and the life they built together." Little Daniel gurgled and reached for my face with his tiny hand. I smiled and continued, "And I'm going to tell you those stories too. I'm going to make sure you know where you come from, what your family stands for, what really matters in this life." Marcus appeared beside me. He said, "What are you telling him, Mom?" I said, "Family secrets." Marcus smiled and put his arm around me. He said, "No more secrets, Mom. From now on, we tell the truth." I looked at my son, at the man he had become, and I felt my heart swell with pride. I said, "Yes, From now on, we tell the truth. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat in my chair by the window one last time. The moon was full, casting silver light across the park where I had spent so many hours of my life. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the young bride with nothing but dreams, the mother hiding her success from her son, the widow learning to stand alone, the woman who finally claimed her truth. I had been called a failure by my own son, and in response, I had shown him who I really was. Not to hurt him, not to prove him wrong, but to give him the chance to see clearly, to grow, to become something better. That's what mothers do. We build foundations, we create opportunities, we support and nurture and hope, and sometimes we have to step back and let our children face the truth, even when it's painful. I closed my eyes and smiled. Daniel, I thought, our boy turned out okay after all, and our grandson is going to be even better. And sitting there in the moonlight, in the small apartment I had chosen for its simplicity and its view, I felt richer than I had ever felt in my life. Not because of the money, not because of the properties or the investments or the foundation, but because I had finally been seen, finally been understood, finally been appreciated for who I was. Eleanor Mitchell, mother, wife, grandmother, quiet builder of empires. And that was more than enough.